أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين. We begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. We welcome our friends in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of A Conversation with Al-Hajj Maurice Salah Khan. I am pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Today, we have a special broadcast, another special broadcast with another very special guest. My dear friend, Heather Gray, is a broadcast journalist based in Atlanta, Georgia. We've had an association now for a number of years. I do consider her a dear friend. I am proud of the work that she has done over the years as an activist-oriented journalist. For our friends in South Africa, I'm sure that you will be warmed to know that this is one of the American veteran activists of South Africa's anti-apartheid movement. She has an extensive resume, but I'm going to end right there with that little bit of an introduction and just simply say that we are going to have a role reversal of sorts with today's broadcast. Instead of me initiating the questions concerning the topic at hand, she's going to be the one doing this instead. We're going to be, again, talking about the case of our sister in Islam, Dr. Aafia Siddiqui, a political prisoner now held for almost 2 decades. First, for the first 5 years in secret imprisonment and under torturous conditions overseas, and for the remainder of this time as a prisoner here in the United States of America. We're going to be talking about Aafia as another step toward the mobilization that's scheduled for later this month on the 23rd of October for Fort Worth, Texas, right outside the base where our sister Aafia is being held. Before we begin this conversation that will entail a role reversal for today's broadcast, I want to show a little bit of video footage on a British journalist, Victoria Brittain, very well known and respected, from the comments she made years ago during the time when Aafia Siddiqui was on trial in New York City. Listen to what Victoria Brittain had to say.
Well, I think what it's important to know about this is a very complex case, and it's been made confusing, but it isn't actually confusing. And I think the way to look at it is in its 3 bits. The first bit was the kidnapping of Aafia. Now, originally, the Pakistanis and the Americans just said she disappeared and said that they didn't have her. There's now been evidence on tape from the Pakistani police official who was in charge of arresting her and the 3 children and disappearing her. So it's not confusing. She didn't disappear for 5 years. She was disappeared. The second thing is when she reappeared in Afghanistan, in Ghazni, that was extremely peculiar and nobody understood where she'd come from or why she should be there. But I think it's quite clear that the so-called evidence that she had in her handbag that was supposed to prove her to be a terrorist was completely laughable. But the most important thing is that when she was in the police station in Ghazni, where there were some FBI agents and some American soldiers, and she is alleged to have picked up a gun and shot at them. In fact, the forensic evidence that her defense lawyers produced after 2 very, very exhaustive visits to Afghanistan, showed that there was no fingerprint of hers on the gun. There was no DNA of hers, and there was no bullet hole that came from that particular gun. So I think we can see that that was a scene that was set. The third bit was when she was brought back to America. And why was she brought back to America? She's a Pakistani citizen. She should have, if anything, been taken to Pakistan. Anyway, she was brought back to America in a wheelchair with these 2 shots to the stomach. And in her trial, in the course of the trial, the only evidence against her, there was no forensic, so the only evidence against her came from the soldiers who were present. And according to not one, but several lawyers I've spoken to, those soldiers in the courtroom contradicted each other, but also contradicted the initial statements that they'd made about who stood where and who was there and when she did this and where she was exactly. So I think it's a tragic thing for American justice that the jury found her guilty. But in the climate of New York, post 9/11, somebody whose reputation had been completely trashed deliberately by the people who leaked stories that she was a gun runner or a money launderer for Al-Qaeda, that she was married into a big Al-Qaeda family. All these things were lies, but they were put out into the media. And so not surprisingly, in America, people who didn't know any of the details had an image of her, and it was that false image which allowed her to be convicted. As for getting 86 years, outrageous is the only possible word for this sentence.
I could not agree more. Outrageous sums it up in a very precise way. Without any further ado, we have our friend. I want to invite her to the platform, Heather Gray. Heather Gray, again, is an action-oriented, an activist-oriented broadcast journalist. She's an executive with the radio station based in Atlanta, WRFG FM radio, part of the Pacifica Network, and we welcome her to the broadcast today as the guest interviewer for this Salam Media broadcast. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Maury.
Good to see you again.
Well, it's good to see you as well. Thank you.
Okay, so now the show is in your hands. You do with it as you will for the next roughly 50 minutes.
Yeah, as Dr. King would say, where do we go from here? There's just so
Where
much.
do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? So, yeah. Maury, I'm just curious, how did you get involved with Aafia Siddiqui's case? What's the origin of that? That's
a good startup question. There's a large center. In fact, it's one of the largest centers in the state of Maryland. The Islamic Society of Baltimore, also known as Masjid al-Rahma, located in Baltimore County, Maryland. This, I was at that time a frequent visitor to ISB, and I frequently spoke there. The administration that was in control of the center at the time was very open and supportive of the human rights work their brother Saleh Khan was doing. And so I spoke quite frequently at ISB. On one occasion, I was the guest khatib responsible for delivering the Friday sermon. It's roughly, it can average anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. It's a regular weekly ritual that is an obligation upon the men in Islam and strongly recommended for the women. I was the guest khatib to deliver the khutbah, the sermon for that day. And as always, when I deliver these types of presentations, my presentation comes through the prism of human rights. I don't know what the topic was on that day, but I do remember that after the service ended, and we had our customary human rights table in the lobby, and there were people coming to the table to acquire, the materials that we had on it, or to ask questions or to make comments. There was this one young woman, I'll never forget her. She came to the table and she asked me, do you know who Aafia Siddiqui is? My response to her was, I've heard of her. I've heard of her case, but I don't really know much about it. She said, would you like to know more? My response, of course, was yes. I ended up meeting with this young lady and her parents later it was either that same evening or the next day. We met, we discussed Aafia's case for about an hour. As it turns out, this was a Muslim sister who was related to Aafia through marriage. And it ended up just being a profoundly impacting, roughly hour to hour and a half discussion we had. And after that discussion, I did what I normally do before we weigh into cases, taking a position on a human rights case. We do our homework. We do our research to make sure that we come down on the right side of the issue, on the justice side of the issue. And so the more I investigated this sordid saga of Dr. Aafia Siddiqui, the more I realized this was one of the most egregious violations of a human being in the name of national security and a war on terrorism. And that was when I became involved. It was 2009, a year after Aafia Siddiqui had been brought back to the United States, barely alive, and in the process of being rehabilitated just well enough to be able to be put on trial in 2010, what masqueraded as a trial, and then railroaded into prison under an 86-year sentence. But again, it was 2009. Let me say this, though. A few years earlier, when the FBI was making its rounds in the wake of 9/11, when it was making its rounds to any Muslim leader or activist that was active in the United States doing work, I got my visit. And I remember at that first visit, because I had more than one, that first visit that I had with Aafia, these three agents who came to my home, we sat and initially I got a call. They said they wanted to meet with me. Would I be willing to come to their the bureau, I guess, in for the DMV area? And I said, no, you can come to my home and we can talk there. And so they arrived, three of them. And we sat at my dining room table and had a roughly 30-minute to 45-minute conversation. I remember that during one point in that conversation, they put out a spread of photos and asked me if I knew any of these people. One of those persons I would later remember was a photograph of Aafia Siddiqui. Mm-hmm. So that was my first time hearing about Aafia. But then a few years later, when she was brought back to the United States, barely alive, that's when I became more involved in her case from 2009 on. And I've been deeply involved in her case ever since.
I think it would be good to get a little bit of the background of what she had been doing in the United States prior to this, because she was a student here, right, yes, in the United States, and a remarkable academic. So why don't you give a little bit of that background as well, Maury?
Aafia Siddiqui came to the United States when she was 18 years old, 1990. Mm-hmm. She did her freshman year at the University of Houston, was an outstanding student in her freshman year. She got a full scholarship to MIT. She went off to MIT in Boston, where she spent most of her American years. She ended up graduating from MIT with honors, went from there to Brandeis University, where she would later acquire a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, not nuclear science, not any other science related to how to build a bomb or any or biological weapons, nothing like that. Cognitive science. That's what her PhD was in. And at heart, Aafia Siddiqui is a teacher. Her goal, her ambition was to go back home with the fruits of her American higher level education and use it to help revolutionize the educational system in Pakistan, especially for children that had learning disabilities. This is what she was. And so during her years in the United States, first of all, she distinguished herself when she was a freshman at the University of Houston. There's a video clip of Aafia Siddiqui. Anyone can go and see it. They can pull it up on YouTube. All you have to do is put in Aafia Siddiqui 1990, Houston, Texas.
Maury, why don't you spell her name?
Aafia, Aafia, Siddiqui, Siddiqui. Put in the YouTube search link, Aafia Siddiqui 1990 or Aafia Siddiqui Houston, Texas, and you'll see this video that will pop up of a young 19-year-old, then Aafia Siddiqui, in all yellow. She is addressing an audience that featured a number of high-profile Muslims at the University of Houston. She gives this phenomenal speech. It's about 19 minutes in length on the rights and responsibilities of Muslim women according to Islam, according to the Quran and Sunnah. It's a very scholarly yet easily digestible presentation. Very impressive. She's only 19 years of age. She's not reading from a from a sheet in front of her. She's looking out at the audience, speaking extemporaneously. The reason why she was able to do this was because of the fire of Islam that burns in this young woman's heart. She is a hafida of Quran. In addition to being this extraordinary academic, she is also a hafida of Quran, meaning she has memorized the entire Quran from cover to cover. And so when she speaks, she's speaking from a vantage point of having internalized the message of the Quran. And she's also by her very nature, she's a da'i. She's someone who takes joy in spreading the message of Islam for purposes of education and also for purposes of clarification. And so this is what she was known for. Now, as a result of this extraordinary extracurricular activity that she engaged in Boston, she got the attention of Christian and Jewish Zionists in Boston, and others who had this animus, felt this animus toward Islam and Muslims. She became a target. And I believe, surely Almighty God knows the best, I believe that this was the primary reason why Aafia became a person of interest after 9/11. Because of all of the disinformation, all of the malicious slandering, the attacks on this young student, this exchange student from Pakistan that went on for a number of years. She was already on the radar of the authorities simply because of her legal activism, her constitutionally protected activism. This is who she was. And so, a few years would pass, and she would, acquire her master's degree and then her PhD degree. She would leave the United States, but then when she left, a cloud of suspicion followed her in 2002. And by this time, Aafia Siddiqui was married. She was married. She had 2 young children, and she was pregnant with her 3rd child. And she went back home, and within months of her returning home in 2002, in March of 2003, she was the target of a rendition operation. She was in a taxi on her way to the airport with her children. Her plan was to visit a maternal uncle in Islamabad, and also during that visit, pay a visit to a number of political figures, leaders within the country, to, basically share with them her vision for a better educational system in Pakistan. But she never made it. The taxi was stopped. She was forcibly removed, her and her children. And then for the next 5 years, from March 2003 until the summer, I believe it was July of 2008, she was disappeared.
She was disappeared where? Where was she? Where did she go?
From Karachi, Pakistan. She was disappeared from Karachi, Pakistan. We don't know all the places where Aafia was held. We do know the final place that she was held, that she spent most of her years of secret imprisonment, was in Bagram, where the United States had control of a detention center where prisoners of war were taken, interrogated, tortured, and Aafia Siddiqui, as I understand it, ended up being the only female prisoner that was held at Bagram.
I think one of the things that, excuse me, it's good for all of us to understand is the relationship that the United States has with Pakistan. What is it?
Well, it's a relationship that is fraught with ups and downs. In fact, right now, it's hard to say whether the relationship that the U.S. government has with the Pakistani government is on the upward swing, or it's still down. We know that through a number of intercontinental machinations, including that of the United States. The Prime Minister, Imran Khan, was recently removed from office. The U.S. establishment might be a bit more friendly now toward the government that has replaced him. But again, it's a relationship that is up and down, up and down. During the time of the Musharraf regime, which was when Aafia Siddiqui was kidnapped, during that period, the Musharraf government was basically America's man in Islamabad. He basically did America's bidding. When America said jump, how high, master, was the response from the government. And there were many men and boys that were picked up and sold for bounties in Pakistan. Most of them ended up
at the behest of the United States. At the behest of the United States.
At the behest of the United States, yes.
Right. Okay.
Part of the war on terror. And this unfortunate human being, a former leader of Pakistan, Parvez Musharraf, even had the lack of foresight, I would say, to actually boast about this in his book. I believe the book was entitled In the Line of Fire. He actually boasted about the number, his government's cooperation with America during the war on terrorism, and the amount, the millions of dollars that they accrued in bounties for those quote unquote terrorists that were handed over. These were men and boys, most of them, and many of the vast majority of the disappeared had nothing to do with any kind of jihad that was that America twisted to make it appear was a threat to its national security. But
I think one of the things that we need to mention here, because all of this is incredibly complex, and your review of it all is just wonderful. But I mean, a lot of this has to do with the 9/11 incident. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So let's just briefly do a summary of that as well, Maury. I mean, so 9/11 took place. Let's talk about what that was.
9/11.
But
9/11.
then it led to all of this. Go ahead, please.
How could we not forget 9/11 and the place that it has in all of this?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
there was an attack on the United States of America. In concert with that attack, there was a convergence of opportunity that is beyond imagination. You know, NORAD failed to respond the way that NORAD is supposed to respond to any threat in the skies of the United States, in any threat in the skies of the United States, that poses a threat. NORAD didn't respond to the attack on the World Trade Center with the airliner. It didn't respond to the attack on the Pentagon. It didn't respond to the attack that was pending on the U.S. Capitol. It was thought by the plane that was brought down by the activism of, these courageous folk on the airliner over Pennsylvania. NORAD failed to respond. Along with NORAD's failure to respond, the U.S. government failed to respond to warnings. And this is a documented fact. There were warnings that supposedly came through secret channels from the state of Israel, the apartheid Zionist state of Israel, that a threat was pending on the U.S. I remember reading years ago that then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon was scheduled to deliver a speech in New York City. And the Shin Bet, the secret services of Israel, prevented him from making that trip. Why? Because of the threat on the United States. What we also know is that on the day that the attack took place on the World Trade Center, there were a number of Israeli nationals that were on a rooftop filming this from northern New Jersey. They were filming it from across the river, and they were celebrating. Mm-hmm. They were filming the attack and celebrating. They ended up being arrested, interrogated, and then quietly, I guess, sent back to Israel. So we know this happened. We also know from the investigation that was done by this movement of very sober-minded professionals. These are not, folks that go off on wild conspiracy trips. These are sober-minded, highly trained professionals. The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. That's what they're called. You can Google them. Over 1,000 of them who conducted their own investigation. And what they concluded with was that all three of the buildings, the two that were hit by airliners, as well as the building that wasn't hit by an airliner, all came down through controlled demolitions. All right. So there's just an abundance. And then it was discovered also that there were a number in different parts of the country, Israeli operatives engaged in their usual stuff in the lead up to 9/11. So what we know is that before the buildings came down, Osama bin Laden had been accused of being the mastermind behind it before the buildings even came down. Mm-hmm. As had been the case a few years earlier in 1995 with the attack, the bombing that took place at the building in Oklahoma City. The same thing. Osama bin Laden was accused. He was accused of the attack on the embassy in Tanzania. And I remember there being a European diplomat who preferred to remain anonymous. He was quoted in a number of publications. He said, if Osama bin Laden did not exist, America would have to create him. So Osama bin Laden was being accused of everything. The Taliban, who was in control at the time of Afghanistan, said to the United States when the U.S., the Bush administration, was demanding them to turn over Osama bin Laden to the United States, they responded repeatedly, if you say he is responsible for the attack, just show us the evidence and we will turn him over. The evidence was never produced. America, in its usual posture of arrogance, the arrogance of power, just continued to demand him that he be turned over or else. And we know what the or else ended up being, an attack, an unwarranted, unjustified attack on Afghanistan. And we saw what the over 2 decades of destruction on that land and its people has brought in its wake. The final thing I should say, Heather, I was about to call you Amy. Amy.
All right.
The final thought, Heather, is, and this is very important. This is very, very important. From time to time, during the around the time of the lead up to 9/11. After 9/11. After 9/11, and then all the way up to the lead up to Osama bin Laden being found and killed, assassinated.
Mm.
I would sometimes visit the FBI's website, and after Osama bin Laden was killed, that was the last time I visited the website for Osama bin Laden. I wanted to see what it said, what the wanted poster had to say about Osama bin Laden in the immediate aftermath of his assassination, because I was intrigued by the fact that with the listing of what he was wanted for, 9/11, the attacks of September 11th was never mentioned in the list. I went back there.
That's interesting. Is
that is very interesting. It's very interesting. And I went there the day, it was either the day of or the day after he was killed. I wanted to check the list again, and it was still up, and still there was no listing of Osama bin Laden being suspected or believed or accused of masterminding the September 11th attacks. So what does that say about America's leading investigative organization on the domestic side, not having what they felt to be concluding evidence that he was responsible for 9/11?
Fascinating, really. I know that we could talk a lot about this, but I do want us to get back to Aafia Siddiqui, because the United States was implicating her in the 9/11 situation. Is that correct or no?
The U.S. accused Aafia of being a functionary of Al Qaeda.
Okay.
All right, a female functionary of Al Qaeda, and they accused her of carrying blood diamonds that were used to finance terrorist acts. And what's interesting about this is that the dates that they claimed Aafia Siddiqui was in Africa functioning as this functionary for Al Qaeda in this purchase of blood diamonds, there was documented evidence that she was in Boston.
Oh. Huh.
Engaged in her student activities.
That's a bit of a dispute.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And so, that's basically it. She was accused of being a functionary for Al Qaeda, and on the basis of that and that alone, she was branded a danger to the United States of America, and supposedly before her arrest wanted for questioning.
Mark, let's just get into some of what Aafia Siddiqui was doing, though, in Boston in the United States before she was arrested. She was, I mean, she's an utterly brilliant woman, yes. But I know that she was doing organizing work, and educating, I guess, the population about so much. But could you tell us what she was organizing around when she was doing all of this in Boston? What was she educating the public about, essentially?
essentially, she was educating the public about Islam. That was her. That was the passion that Aafia Siddiqui had. She wanted to teach, spread the message of Islam because, she believed in her heart, as any committed Muslim does, that the system of life and living, the system of governance, of Islam, of true Islam, not this, not these rather disappointing caricatures of Islam we find in different parts of the Muslim world today, but true Islam is the solution to what ails not just her home country of Pakistan, and not just the briefly adopted country of America that she spent her collegiate years in. But this is something that could be a help and a benefit for all of humanity. So she had this passion within her to spread the message of Islam. Also keep in mind that this was during the time when Islam and Muslims were being attacked. There are those within the within the American establishment that would try to have us believe that everything changed after 9/11. That Muslims became suspicious and they became a target for investigation and what have you, manipulation, exploitation after 9/11. That is a big lie. It had been going on for years and years before 9/11. In fact, I would set the date for Muslims and Islam becoming a target of the quote unquote New World Order as after the fall of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed and America emerged as the sole remaining superpower, quote unquote, in the world, the military industrial complex and the national security complex that emanated from it needed a new enemy. They found that new enemy in Islam. You had the role that the Mujahideen, that was then supported by the United States, referred to by the Bush administration as and the administration before him as in fact, under his father's administration, Bush 1's administration, they referred to the Mujahideen of Afghanistan as freedom fighters. During the Reagan administration, freedom fighters. And if you recall, Heather, if you recall, during the Reagan administration, they were sending highly sophisticated arms, weaponry, shoulder carried. I forgot what these things are called that could bring down low flying planes. I mean, they were exporting all of this to the Mujahideen of Afghanistan in its proxy war against the then Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, America needed a new enemy. It operates under the premise, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they were friends then. Once the Soviet Union was removed, the new enemy became the very same freedom fighters that were hailed years earlier. And so this is basically what happened. And then you had the Islamic Revolution that took place in Iran and the removal of America's policemen in the Gulf, the Shah of Iran. And so you had all of this convergence that took place. And that's when the targeting of Muslims in a very significant way began. You might remember the blind Egyptian Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. He was his visit to the United States was facilitated by elements within the U.S. government. Why? Because when he first started coming here, he was an asset. Why? Because he spoke out vigorously and justly against the occupation of Afghanistan, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And so he was viewed as an asset of the United States. But then once again, the Soviet Union was removed, the blind sheikh became uh, a liability. And we know what ultimately happened to him. He was framed for being the mind, the mastermind behind the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. He was put on trial for seditious conspiracy, along with a number of his confidants, with the exception of the FBI paid informant Imad Salem. And he ended up being railroaded into prison under a life sentence. None of the January 6th convicts for seditious conspiracy will get a life sentence, I predict. But he got a life sentence, and he ultimately died in prison. So, you know, this targeting of Islam and Muslims goes all the way back to the early 90s. And it just, in fact, even before the 90s, but it started in earnest, you know, after around 1979 and what happened on 9/11, and the response to what happened on 9/11 was just the latest expression of, you know, the dogged determination to manipulate this targeting of Islam and Muslims for all it's worth. And Aafia became one of the targets of this.
So all of this then leads to the oppression by the U.S. government of Aafia Siddiqui. Is that correct?
And many others, yes.
Well, yes, and many others, absolutely. But tonight we're focusing primarily on Aafia Siddiqui.
Yes.
So again, where do we go from here? So they just continued just observing her and watching her and oppressing her.
Yes.
I guess we should go into a bit of the detail of what the U.S. government did as far as Aafia Siddiqui is concerned, Maury. I mean, some of their tactics and what they did to her before. And she is just, we need to repeat, she's in prison now in Texas, and we want to get into more, a little bit, not a little bit, but quite a bit of detail about that as well. But what did the U.S. government start doing to Aafia Siddiqui?
Well, it began, the U.S. government began its campaign against Aafia when she and her family were still in Boston. In fact, I believe that the pressures that the U.S. government put on this family through the FBI and who knows whatever other mechanism they were utilizing, I believe that factored significantly into the tensions that were raised within her family life. You know, the tensions that ultimately led to her being abused, physically abused, and probably emotionally abused by her then husband, and ultimately divorced. I mean, not long after they returned to Pakistan from the United States, he divorced her.
Because he was not supportive of what she was doing as far as organizing around and educating about
my understanding is that he wasn't really supportive of Aafia Siddiqui's all of her activism. You know, you raised the question of what she was doing. What the primary thing she was doing was, again, engaging in the dawah, the educating of non-Muslims and new Muslims to the faith of the religion of Islam. She was deeply engaged in dawah. She held she led sister groups where she made her knowledge and expertise available to sisters who wanted to grow intellectually and she also started this small organization for that brought books and pamphlets on Islam into men and women who were incarcerated in and around Boston. So she did that, and in fact, the masjid that she used to store these boxes of books and other materials, that was none other than the Mosque for the Praising of Allah, Masjid Alhamdulillah, which is it was headed then and continues to be headed by one of the most senior African-American Muslim leaders in the greater Boston area. In fact, he's going to be joining us in Texas, inshallah ta'ala, on the 23rd of this month for the rally for Aafia, Imam Abdullah Farooq. So, and then the other thing, if you remember, Heather, the Bosnian crisis, and if you can recall the point at which genocide was documented, and there was pressure on the United States and other governments and on the United Nations to do something about it, to stop the genocide that was taking place. Well, Aafia Siddiqui, I remember, I'll never forget, and this was on my first visit to Boston, to talk to people that knew her when she was a student there. It was then that I met Imam Abdullah Farooq, and I'll never forget his words. He said, "Brother, do you remember the Bosnian crisis?" I said, "Yes, sir, I do." He said, "If we were to point to one person who was most responsible for galvanizing the greater Boston community to respond to the humanitarian part of that crisis, it was this little, roughly 100-pound, soaking wet, maybe 5 foot in height student, Aafia Siddiqui." Mm. So she was she was just a dynamo of positive energy. She had a love not just for Islam. Aafia Siddiqui is someone who had a love for humanity. She couldn't have been a terrorist, helping to facilitate the targeting of innocent people, in a million years. She is someone who had a love for humanity.
I just want to say, Mari, it's interesting because this whole discussion, in countless ways, but at the beginning of our discussion this evening, you brought up the issue of human rights, right? Mm-hmm. So in the 1960s and in the 70s and so forth, people who were involved in the civil rights movement started, and this is including Dr. King, started moving toward human rights, a focus on human rights, that it's not something that is instituted by the state. It's something that we are humans and we need to be respectful of the other.
That's right.
Right? So I'm sure you could expound on that a little bit. Maybe if you could just say a little bit about human rights, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Your question and what you just said reminded me of my response. Most of the time, it's an internal response. If I'm sitting in an audience, on occasion, it's an external response. I will remind the person who just said this, when they refer to Malcolm, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, as a civil rights activist. No such thing. Malcolm was a human rights leader and activist. And he was someone who recognized the distinction between civil rights and human rights then. And one of the powerful things to remember about Dr. King is that he did as well. Mm-hmm. In that fertile, thought-provoking and heartbreaking last year of his life, but also inspiring. Mm-hmm. and heartbreaking only because he was assassinated, but also so inspiring last year of his life. He emphasized over and over and over the distinction between civil rights and human rights. And this is what helped to not only cause the Johnson administration to distance themselves and kind of punish him in an indirect way for his criticisms of our misadventure in Indochina and Vietnam. But also it caused a number of his colleagues in the civil rights movement to distance themselves in that final year of his life. They cautioned him first, this is, going above and beyond what our mandate is. We're civil rights leaders, and Martin would have nothing to do with that. No, it was a matter of conscience, and this is what human rights is. Human rights is something that transcends national boundaries. And so when I say this to the young, any of the young activists who may see this today's broadcast and have this tendency of referring to King and to Malcolm and to many others, Robeson and so many others as civil rights leaders, you know, you need to really appreciate the fact that there is this distinction, and begin to emphasize human rights over civil rights, because human rights trumps civil rights. Human rights are the God-given rights that are given to all of us around the world, and no one can take them away. No one can take them away. This is the reason why Malcolm, when in his final year, year of life, he was emphasizing the internationalization of the so-called Negro problem. You know, he wanted to he took it to the United Nations. He took it to a number of leaders of countries overseas as these countries were emerging from colonialism in Africa and in parts of Asia. You know, he was emphasizing human rights, human rights, human rights. And this is what we should be doing today, because America, in its arrogant posture, has the tendency to presume and to give others the impression that, you know, America doesn't have human rights violations. We don't have political prisoners. When we do, we have many, and those numbers are growing. We just had, and we have two types of political prisoners. We have the political prisoners of conscience, like Dr. Aafia Siddiqui, like Imam Jamil Abdullah Alamin, like Leonard Peltier, like so many of the other political prisoners that have been locked down, are growing old and dying off in America's gulag. We have those prisoners of conscience, Mutula Shakur, and so many others. And then we also have those political prisoners who are made political prisoners by the circumstance of bigotry, racial bigotry, class bigotry, religious bigotry. We just had a recent political prisoner of that stripe released after 23 years of wrongful imprisonment right here out of Baltimore, Adnan Syed, who was just 17 when he was a newly minted political prisoner of bigotry, of ethnic and religious bigotry, and combined with police and prosecutorial misconduct.
Well, thank you for all of that. But let's get back to Aafia Siddiqui. So she was being targeted largely because, well, that's the other thing. She was quite engaged in human rights issues. Pardon me?
Yes, her activism. Yes.
For activism. So I think it would be helpful also, Maury, if we discussed exactly what happened when she was in Afghanistan and they accused her of getting this gun or whatever, and then she was shot herself. Let's just briefly go over those details so people understand the farce of all of this. But please explain that. Would you do that?
Yes. After Aafia was discovered by the outside world of being held at Bagram, and that came about as a result of 4 Arab Muslims escaping from Bagram, and then later a United Kingdom citizen who was held there, positively identifying Aafia from a photograph. Yet this is the woman that we used to see. This was prisoner 650. Well, after the United States authorities in Afghanistan and here could not deny any longer that they were holding a female prisoner, they ended up releasing Aafia. They still continue to deny it was Aafia Siddiqui. Yes, we have a female prisoner, but it's not Aafia Siddiqui. What they ended up doing then was they released Aafia. They took her from her prison cell. They put her on a bus, reunited her with her son Ahmed, who she hadn't seen in 5 years, the oldest child, bused them from Bagram to Ghazni, where she was then released in the area of a governor's compound. As soon as she was released, someone dropped a dime, an American authority. There's this non-Afghan woman, this threatening-looking non-Afghan woman standing lurking outside of the governor's compound, and this young boy. We believe she might be a suicide bomber. We believe that the intent was for Aafia to be shot on sight by Afghan authorities, and if that had happened, it would have been a convenient case closed.
Mm-hmm.
But Almighty God, as we say in Islam, the qadr of Allah, Allah intervened. Aafia heard the adhan calling coming from a nearby masjid. She went into the masjid. She was, and because in that part of the world, women do not frequent the masjid, of course, she drew the attention of the men who were there. They were attempting to communicate with her. The authorities arrived. They take her into custody. They take her from her and this young boy to the police compound, and they put her behind a curtain. The authorities, of course, American authorities, are made aware that this mysterious woman has been taken into custody. And so they arrive, American soldiers, FBI, and no doubt CIA, to argue for Aafia's, that Aafia be turned over to them. And the police commander, the Afghan police commander, was hesitant because she was on Afghan soil. She was an Afghan prisoner. And so as they're arguing over custody, Aafia, hearing the voices of the Americans, and she testified to this. This is what she shared during the trial. She heard the voices of the Americans. She began to feel panic. She thought about the secret prison, not wanting to go back. She got up, looked through the curtain to see if there was an escape door close by. And when she looked through, one of the American soldiers sitting across this small, crowded room, he saw her and he panicked. He panicked. He jumped up and he shouted, "The prisoner is free." Took out his sidearm and fired. Shot Aafia 2 or 3 times in the torso. They rushed behind the curtain. They handcuffed her. And from what I understand, an argument ensued between Afghan authorities and the American authorities. The Afghans then, insisted that she get medical treatment. They helivaced her from there, probably back to where they were based, where the primary base was. She was given emergency medical treatment, and as soon as she was stabilized, and this is a very important point, in violation of international law, in violation of Afghan sovereignty and international law, they brought her without permission of the Afghan authorities out of Afghanistan, brought her back to the United States. A few days later, wheeled her into the courtroom in Lower Manhattan, blocks away from Ground Zero, in a wheelchair, slumped over in a wheelchair, couldn't even sit up straight, and arraigned her for attempted murder of U.S. personnel in Afghanistan. And for attempted murder, where nobody was injured but Aafia Siddiqui, and where there was no forensic evidence to support the allegations that she fired a weapon at American personnel. And with a sworn affidavit, against a sworn affidavit from the Afghan police commander, who issued the affidavit to one of Aafia's attorneys to say the prisoner never touched a weapon. Despite all of this, Aafia Siddiqui was found guilty by a judge, a jury, in what masqueraded as a court process, presided over a Zionist judge. Richard Berman is his name. Mm-hmm. In a very openly hostile fashion. He was not balanced. He didn't pretend to have any balanced subhanallah at all. He was openly bigoted toward Aafia. And at the end of the day, when this jury came back with a finding of guilty on all counts, despite all of this, despite the fact that, as Victoria Brittain indicated in her remarks, and she was there for the trial in New York City, when in her remarks, she said that the forensic evidence did not support the allegations, and also the government's witnesses committed perjury. They committed perjury. I was there. I was there from start to finish. I heard them contradict themselves, each other, and then contradict themselves, what they had said earlier. They should have been charged with perjury, but they weren't. They weren't. And Aafia, in this New York City federal courthouse, was found guilty, and the judge, Berman, decided to apply terrorism sanctions, even though it wasn't a terrorism case, to justify giving her an 86-year sentence, a life sentence, in a case where no one was injured but Aafia Siddiqui. And this is the reason why Professor Noam Chomsky, this is the reason why the late former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, this is the reason why so many others, the union, the labor union in Boston, one of the most bigoted cities in the country. In Boston, a labor union in Boston called for Aafia Siddiqui's release in a official resolution. The reason for it is because this is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment for this country that likes to project itself around the world as the land of liberty and justice for all. It is an embarrassment.
So, Mari, let's just talk about that. She's
you know something? Wait, before we talk about anything else, I should note that we are at the 1 hour mark. So let's conclude this within the next 5 minutes.
Exactly. So let's talk about how she is right now, while she's in prison in Texas, and about the demonstration that's about to take place.
Okay.
How is she doing?
Aafia Siddiqui, we don't know it. There's only two people from the outside, to my knowledge, that has access to her from the outside. That is her attorney, who is based in Texas, and she has been involved in the case now for a little over a year. And the head of the consul general for the Pakistani consulate in Houston, Texas. It's this consulate that has oversight responsibility to ensure that their prisoner is being treated humanely. And they have failed. Generally speaking, with one or maybe two exceptions over the years, they have failed miserably in this responsibility. But these are the only two persons that can visit Aafia Siddiqui. So we really don't know what her condition is. I heard her attorney doesn't communicate with me as much and as well as Brother Salakhan would like, but that's a whole other thing. From what we understand, from what limited knowledge I do have, Aafia Siddiqui is in a better state mentally than we feared she might be in. Okay,
that's great. So tell us about the demonstration and how people can get information about it. And so
demonstration is scheduled for Sunday, March 23rd. We had a demonstration last year. We had about 300 to 400 people outside the gates of FMC Carswell, outside that military base where Aafia is being held, and we want to double that number this year, inshallah. But people can we're going to be there in front of FMC Carswell from 4 to 6, a 2-hour demonstration. And folks can reach out to me. They can through the website avia.org. They can go to www.avia.org, or they can also reach out to me if they need to call or text. My number is 202-246-9608. They can email me at peacethroughjustice@aol.com, or at Mauri, Salakhan, SAALAKHAN, at Aafia, AAFIA.org. Any of those means. But we want people to turn out. If you live in Texas or you live near Texas, you hear me, my Louisiana brothers and sisters, you're within driving distance of Dallas, Fort Worth, please join us on this date. We believe that this year, because of all that has happened in the United States with the COVID pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and with various other things that have happened, what happened on January 6th and the attention that it's getting, we are in a very unique position to be able to bring much needed attention to justice-oriented issues, especially as it pertains to political prisoners and getting relief. But we can't do this without an effort. So please, please join us. If you can't join us, help spread the word. This video, this interview, spread this as far and wide as you possibly can. And if you're in a position to make a donation, a financial donation to this effort, please do. You can go to the website, afia.org, visit the PayPal link and make a donation there. If you want to send a donation directly to us via mail or what have you, just communicate with Brother Salakan. I'll give you the address for a check or a money order or for any other means of conveying a donation. Money is ammunition in these campaigns. We need it. We need your support.
And again, the demonstration is on October the 23rd.
Yes, Sunday. That's a Sunday.
I'm going to ask you to repeat again the website one more time.
The website is www.aafia.org.
Thank you, Mari Salakan.
Thank you, dear Heather. Thank you so much. And I want to say again to my brothers and sisters in South Africa, what you're looking at is one of our soul sisters from another tribe who has had some very deep and meaningful engagement in South Africa during the height of apartheid. Mm-hmm. She was one of the American activists. So, you know, you need to appreciate this sister you're seeing in front of you right now. I appreciate you, Heather.
Thank you. I appreciate you and your work. Thank you.
All right. We end this broadcast as we normally do with the verse from the Quran, from the surah known as Asr, the time. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First in Arabic. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal Asr. Innal insana lafi kusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati. Wa tawasaw bil haqq. Wa tawasaw bis sabr. Which means, in the translation of the meaning, in the name of Allah, in the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. By the token of time through the ages, surely humanity is in loss, except those who believe and do good, and exhort one another to truth, and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Peace be unto you all. Assalamu